Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to my friends and colleagues from ICC Languages. Thank you for coming. You can see visually at an instant what we're going to be talking about today together, I hope, one way or the other. Shakespeare in the age of artificial intelligence. And this image we see here is one first example of an artificially generated image. And it's very clever, I must admit. But we're going to be digging a little deeper into the connection between the natural intelligence of a great creative genius like William Shakespeare and the artificial intelligence, a product of the intelligence of computer scientists, and see where we stand vis-a-vis Shakespeare's work above all, but in connection with the world in which we live. It's not only the age of AI. Sadly, it is also the age of wars, which are raging, sadly, as I say, climate change, you name it. There's so many problems, an economic crisis, one after the other. So we're spoiled for choice. So what does Shakespeare have to tell us about all this? Well, let's first of all, before we go any further, go over to Shakespeare himself. Thanks to the magic of AI, we can actually interview the man himself and find out a little bit about him for those of you who very unlikely, I think, know nothing about him. So here is an exclusive interview with William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon. I've got the text there for you in case you need to follow the Elizabethan English. Off we go.
ChatGPT, I'd like to practice my Shakespearean English. Can you talk to me as if you were Shakespeare in Shakespearean English? Would that be possible?
Of course, kind sir or madam. I shall endeavour to converse with thee in the language of Shakespeare, as best as I can muster. Pray, speaketh thy queries, and I shall strive to respond in kind.
Is it true you're thinking of building a theatre in London?
Verily, 'tis true, the murmurs of the streets doth speak of such a grand venture. A theatre, a beacon of artistry, to be raised in the heart of London's bustling streets. 'Tis a dream woven with threads of passion and ambition, where players shall tread the boards and bring forth tales to delight the hearts of all who attend. So whispers the wind, carrying tidings of this noble endeavour far and wide.
Well, there you go. Isn't that interesting? It's clever. I'm impressed in a way. On the other hand, one common question that comes up with AI is its reliability, its accuracy. And while being impressed by my friend Russell Stannard's use of AI, because our interviewer there was an expert in technology, Russell Stannard, you may know him. But knowing the Elizabethan English that I know, I can tell you right now that this is not really all that authentic. I would say it was more of a parody than an authentic example of Elizabethan English. And God knows whether Shakespeare would actually have said these things in this particular way. But it's an illustration of how AI can, let's say, entertain us and to some extent inform us. Now, my subtitle is Shakespeare, Our Contemporary ? Some of you who may have studied literature will have heard of a book published exactly 50 years ago now called Shakespeare, Our Contemporary by a Polish critic of Shakespeare. And this text has had a formative influence both on productions of Shakespeare at the RSC, for example, and in generally the interpretation of Shakespeare on a critical level. So I'm asking the question Jan Kott answered 50 years ago, and he answered in the affirmative. And I've read the book recently, and it's very impressive. He really does make Shakespeare relate to the concerns not only of Western Europe, but the Eastern Europe of which he had direct experience of authoritarianism and so on. So That's the question we're asking. Is Shakespeare, in this age of digital technology and wars and economic crisis, still our contemporary? We're comparing the two things, as I've called them, natural intelligence. I don't know if anybody else has come up with this coinage, but I mean by this an intelligence such as that of William Shakespeare, which we could call genius. If anybody was ever a genius, it's William Shakespeare. I may be biased, but I'm a Shakespeare freak, I confess. And we're comparing his, if you like, power to inform us, to educate us, to help us in our everyday lives with artificial intelligence, GPT, chat, whatever it's called, and all the rest of it. So let's see what we should bear in mind as we go on our journey. Think about these questions and the distinction, the difference between wisdom, knowledge, and information. We'll come back to this quotation after we've explored Shakespeare through the texts themselves, but we'll return to this quotation. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? We have just been given an example of the kind of data that AI can generate. The question is, does this constitute knowledge? What indeed is knowledge? And above all, what is wisdom? How can we convert information, knowledge into wisdom? That is the overall macro question I'm asking in order to help me understand if Shakespeare is still relevant today. So let's get into the text. I'm going to ask you to think about one of your favorite speeches from Shakespeare. I'm sure you will have heard at least of To Be or Not to Be. It may be your favorite, it may be one you remember. If you can't think of a favorite speech, think of any speech from Romeo and Juliet, Henry V. There are 37 or 38, maybe even as many as 40 plays now attributed to Shakespeare. I'm going to show you my example of my favorite speech from the whole of Shakespeare's work in just 1 second. But I want to leave you time to interact at least cognitively on the level of thought, if not by using your chat box, with the topics I'm exploring. So are you thinking of a speech from Shakespeare? And are you thinking, is this still powerful, still relevant, still beautiful, or whatever criterion you evaluate Shakespeare with? Are you ready for my favorite speech? Can you guess which one it is? Well, it's this one from King Lear. For me, his greatest achievement, and therefore probably the greatest play ever written. But as I said, I'm biased. Don't pay any attention to it. I'm going to allow you to skim the text, scan the text while you listen, as there are little bits of vocabulary you may struggle with, but please don't worry. Let's look at the essence. What issues is King Lear, the play, Shakespeare raising in this speech from the play? Issues which may still be relevant today.
Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have ta'en too little care of this. Take physic, pomp. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them, and show the heavens more just. Let the superfluous and lust-dieted man that slaves your ordinance, that will not see because he does not feel your power quickly. So distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough.
Well, 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 what do you think of that? I've helped you a little bit by highlighting some of the topics which I think are still relevant today. What strikes us immediately is the first word, poor. And poverty, sadly, we know, on a global level and local level, is still with us. And it brings suffering, and that's why it's important. Homelessness is still with us, and that too brings suffering. We go on a little bit further down. I've highlighted the important bits in red for you. Take physic pomp. If you don't know what this means, it means, I suppose, it's addressed to the rich and the powerful who enjoy luxury, and is telling them to take some medicine to become aware of their privileges. Take physic pomp. Cure yourself, if you like. So he obviously thinks power, pomp, and luxury, privilege, need to cure themselves of some ailments. We'll see what they are. The next line helps us. He's comparing the rich and powerful with the wretched of the earth. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, the wretched of the earth. So that's the first part of a speech which shows us there are issues from Elizabethan times or Jacobean times which are still with us today. In the last two lines of this first extract, we see a hint of a possible solution to the problem in the interesting word superflux. He was a great wordsmith, Shakespeare. Thou mayest shake the superflux to them. He's addressing the gods, the powers that be. And he's suggesting that the excess wealth could be somehow used to show the heavens, the order of things, if you like, the powers that be, to be more just, to be more fair. In the next part of the speech, I ask you, does Shakespeare propose any solution more explicitly? Have a look at the second part, which is actually spoken by Gloucester there. The first part was spoken by King Lear himself, there performed by the wonderful Ian McKellen on the left. On the right, I think we have Gloucester, an aristocrat, the Duke of Gloucester, who suffers a great deal in the play, but he learns a great deal too. And this is his speech. Let the superfluous and lust-dieted man that slaves your ordinance, that will not see because he does not feel your power quickly. And here is a possible solution suggested by Gloucester, not necessarily Shakespeare. This rich man, Gloucester, who's fallen on hard times, so distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough. Now that sounds very specific, and I would say quite radical too. The word distribution clearly refers to distribution of wealth, to undo the abuse of excessive wealth, so we can all live a fairly reasonable, dignified life, so each man have enough. So I don't know exactly what Shakespeare might have meant by this superficially very radical proposal, and very modern too, but we may get a better idea as we go along, whether he's some kind of radical ahead of his time, or perhaps merely feeling compassion for the poor and thinking of a philanthropical way of resolving these problems. We'll find out as we go along. But before that, I want us to stand back a bit and think about Shakespeare as a whole. Those of you who know Shakespeare, most people, I guess, will have some inkling of what he wrote about. And I want us to consider the topics that he was most interested in and how we're going to do this. I'm going to ask you to think of what is probably the most common noun or nouns in Shakespeare's plays. Because these common nouns, for you English teachers or language teachers, it's an interesting exercise, because I'm asking you to predict in frequency terms which nouns come up most frequently in Shakespeare. And why is this important? Because it will give us an indication of the topics he's preoccupied with. So you can think or use the chat box to suggest what you think is a noun. For example, I don't know, truth, love, war, whatever. You see what I mean? And then I'll show you what AI on the level of information told me when I asked it to give me the most common nouns in the whole of Shakespeare's work. Here we go. This is the word cloud that AI came up with. And you may have guessed some of these most common words in Shakespeare's plays. Love plays a big part, as you'll know from Romeo and Juliet, and not only Romeo and Juliet. It's a universal feeling, so it's not surprising, is it? More interesting, perhaps, is the frequency of words like the king and lord. They have something in common. They both belong to the aristocracy, and they are the people in power. And he was, I think we can infer, preoccupied with issues of kingship and the exercise of power in a just and fair manner. There are many, there's the word power, bottom left, by the way, I notice. There are so many things we don't have time to explore, all of these frequent words in Shakespeare, but it'll give you an idea. I'm going to focus, of course, on the two extremes of those in power at the top of the pyramid and those at the bottom, ordinary people, in this talk. So looking at the people at the top, the royalty, the nobility, and the landed gentry, this is a historical, factual piece that I picked up from the internet. Thank you very much to Wikipedia. If you read it, it tells us just how much wealth the royal, the aristocratic class, let's call them, actually control. And I've left out the figure for you to guess. Together, the last sentence says they comprised about how much percent of the families and owned most of the good farmland. Can you guess? Think of a number from 1 to 100. It's actually quite surprising, well, thought-provoking, I think, that 2% of the landed aristocracy, including the monarch, controlled most of the good farmland. What about everybody else? What did they have? The commoners, the ordinary people. Well, this is one way of looking at Elizabethan and Jacobean society in a more global sense. This is, if you like, a world view, which was prevalent at the time. A lot of people believed that this was the way society was organized and had to be organized. And when you look at it, can you think of an adjective which you would use to describe this way of seeing society, where we see God and the angels at the top of the pile, and at the bottom we have animals, plants, and minerals. Just above the animals, plants, and minerals, we have the commoners, the ordinary people. We go up to the gentlemen with titles like Sir. We have the church, the bishops and archbishops. Then we come to the nobles, the dukes and the earls and the barons, and of course the monarch, who was the leading baron of Elizabethan society. Word springs to mind. When I look at this, for me, words like hierarchical, stratified, spring to mind. And that was a prevalent point of view, according to a classic analysis of the Elizabethan world picture by E.M.W. Tilliard, that some of you may have heard of. He calls it the great chain of being. And it had a huge influence on Shakespeare's work, as we shall see. I ask rather cheekily the next question, before we go to AI once again. What about the workers, the commoners, the multitude? Which adjectives do you think Shakespeare uses most frequently to describe the commoners, as they're called? And very often they're also referred to as the multitude. Okay, that's a more polite way in which they're described. But can you think of how he describes them? Positive adjectives, negative adjectives? Again, as you're thinking, I'll explain that I went to my AI application and I asked, can you tell me which adjectives Shakespeare uses as modifiers just before the noun multitude? And this is what it told me. And what does it mean? My God, there's some words hit you straight away. The bigger the font, remember, the more frequent the word, and therefore the concept in Shakespeare's plays. I think probably the most frequent word he uses is, as you can see, have a good look. And if you look at it visually, the word rude stands out. And rude, of course, doesn't simply mean, as it does in modern English, impolite. It means something like vulgar, crude, lowly, peasant-like, barbarous, very negative, base, the low of the low, the lowest of the low, the base, the common people, the desperate crowd, the desperate multitude, and so on. Idle, idle. Well, that's quite frequent, isn't it? Sitting around doing nothing. Perhaps they need to go and find a job. Bold again, I think means something slightly different from what it does today. I don't think it's a positive adjective. In Shakespeare's English, I think it's negative. It means rash and reckless. So a very, very negative picture of the ignorant multitude. So let's get a closer look now. We're going to focus today on two aspects of these themes, war and revolution. An image, again, generated by clever AI. We're going to look at texts, and these are the 6 texts I'll be looking at briefly. Don't worry, I'm not going to stay here till midnight. I've already taken examples from King Lear. There you see it at the bottom with the wonderful Paul Schofield, greatest King Lear ever, according to many. Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, briefly. The very first play Shakespeare wrote was probably Henry VI, part 2. Henry V, great heroic play, played a big part in the Second World War, Churchill's time, fight the Nazis. The Tempest, probably Shakespeare's last play, and the fascinating Coriolanus there, bottom right. These are the plays I'll be taking examples from. It doesn't matter if you don't know any of them. I will explain all, I hope. So let's begin with revolution. Or, if it's not revolution, we're talking about its uprisings in Elizabethan times, rebellions, revolts, whether of the aristocracy or the peasants, the poor people, either in the city or the peasants on the land. And I'm going to take Henry VI, part 2, a very neglected play, if you like. It's not one of his most popular, but as I said, it's probably the first play he ever wrote. And in this play, he shows us a weak monarch. There he is, looking very weak, I must say. Henry VI, the son of Henry V, who was a great heroic figure. And we're going to look at a rebellion, if not a revolution. It was a would-be revolution, let's say. And it's called Jack Cade's Rebellion, because that is the name of the leader. There he is, Jack Cade, a historical figure, 1450. And I want you to think, if there was a rebellion against Henry VI and his reign and his counselors, what were the causes? What were ordinary people unhappy with? What would provoke them to rebel against the authorities? Not necessarily to bring down the government, although in Jack Cade's case, I think he probably was going that far. This is the historical background. These are the facts, let's say, if we can trust Wikipedia, that Jack Cade's rebellion was one of the people, not the aristocrats primarily, and they were complaining about today. Bad administration, I think that's still with us today. Abuse of power, is that still with us? And of course, military issues, war. We may or may not be, sadly or fortunately, involved in wars ourselves, but in our world, wars are raging, sadly. And in those times, there was an endless war with the French called the 100 Years' War. And the ordinary people protested against their constantly being used as cannon fodder for these wars. And as if their poverty wasn't enough. That's the historical side. Now let's look at what Shakespeare says about this rebellion. But before I show you what he says, in other words, I'm going to show you the manifesto of the leaders of this rebellion, Jack Cade's rebellion. But I want you to think of your own political manifesto. There are general elections coming up in the UK. For those of you who are in the UK, imagine you were standing for Parliament. What would you put in your political manifesto to persuade the people, the multitude, to vote for you? Think of one thing. You can write it if you like, or just think it. I hope you've thought of something. Doesn't matter, don't worry if you haven't. But this is how Shakespeare presents Jack Cade and his rebels' aims in 1450. In the play, this is according to Shakespeare, not necessarily historical fact. I've summed up all the grievances and aims of the rebels in the first group, which will interest you as educators. Jack Cade and his rebels will close the grammar schools, ban the teaching of grammar. Some of you may agree with this even today. They will make literacy, reading and writing, a criminal offense. Why? And they will establish English as the only language to be spoken in England, not Latin, not French, or whatever. Think about whether you agree or disagree with any of this. The green themes are to do with food and drink. You may agree that cheap bread is a good idea. If you were a peasant, you certainly would think it was a good idea. And if you wanted to have a good life, lots of good beer and free wine. Sounds like a nice idea, doesn't it? This is what the rebels, according to Shakespeare, promised to do if their revolution was successful. They would kill all the lawyers. This is the judicial policy of the rebels. Kill all the lawyers, scrap the courts, scrap the Inns of Court. No more justice, institutions of justice. And a rag bag of things at the bottom, no money, and everybody will wear the same uniform. Very interesting concept, which even today we may see in recent history, not only in the context of education, but perhaps in some countries where everybody wore the same uniform or similar. And finally, all things shall be in common. Again, this rather radical concept, way ahead of Shakespeare's own time, but it existed centuries before Shakespeare and centuries after Shakespeare, that all things should be in common. On the left, you see a production by the Royal Shakespeare Company with Michael Pennington as the rebel, Jack Cade. But you see, he's dressed up as a member of the British National Front, which is an extremely right-wing party, or was some time ago. So they were making a point about the populism of this particular manifesto. But it's one point of view. And we want to be critical as we read the text that Shakespeare puts into the mouth of the rebels and ask ourselves, is the dialogue he's giving us realistic, or is it satirical, humorous? Do you think he's in favor or against the rebels? And how do we know? So let's go a little bit closer into the actual text and do a little bit of practical criticism, discourse analysis, as we call it in applied linguistics. And I'll give you an example of a short speech by Jack Cade, the leader of the rebellion. There he is, in the middle there in the picture. And Dick the Butcher, which I think is standing on the right of Jack Cade in the picture. And they're talking about abolishing money, everybody wearing the same clothes, as we said, and the brotherhood of man. We agree like brothers, and worship me, their Lord. Now, I put that in blue because I think the red parts are what he presents as the rebels' aims, and the blue bits are the way he deflates the rebels, Shakespeare or whoever. He debunks and ridicules almost their aims. And we'll see this again and again. Dick the Butcher, you see him there, ready with his chopper there. The first thing we'll do is kill all the lawyers. That's funny in a way, but it's macabre funny. Some of you may think it's a good idea to get rid of the lawyers, but killing them all? The bread and the beer, we agree, not a bad idea. And some of you may think things should be in common. There shouldn't be such a stratified, class-ridden society. But then Shakespeare spoils it all, if you like, when he gets paid to proclaim himself king. When I am king, as king I will be. Nobody's going to have a choice in this matter, you see. Quite authoritarian, quite Stalinist, I would say. God save your majesty. So they're making fun of the future leader who's going to make himself a monarch in place of the monarch that they're going to get rid of, Henry VI. And he does it again and again, literally, as I call it, taking the piss, if you pardon the expression, because here Jack Cade promises to convert the pissing conduits of the city into channels for wine, claret wine, for free, of course, at a cheap price. And anybody who does not acknowledge the aristocratic nature of Jack Cade, Lord Mortimer, he calls himself, will be considered treacherous and, of course, will be hung, drawn, and quartered. So you see the way Shakespeare is satirizing these aims of the rebels. Here, he doesn't satirize so much. It's the attack on the judicial system and literacy at the same time, because what the point they're making here, if you have a look, is that the poor men were faced with accusations, matters that they were not able to answer. Why were they not able to answer the crimes they had allegedly committed? And they were put into prison or even hanged. And the reason was they could not read. Most people in Britain, in England at the time, were illiterate. And here the rebels are making the point that the law is loaded against them because they cannot read. And this is a historical fact in a way. Because if you were literate, you demonstrated you were literate. If you could quote the Bible, you got a more lenient punishment. So that's an interesting point. We can laugh at closing the grammar schools. I don't think they mean to open comprehensive schools, but they're against education, again, for a similar reason, because they feel those who did get an education got more privileges and better treatment than they themselves. And it's very funny to read that somebody's going to be punished because he has men about him that usually talk of nouns and verbs. Now, we in ICC and language teaching generally would be at the receiving end of this revolution, because we have in our careers talked a lot about nouns and verbs and subjunctives and so on and so forth. So these are the aims of the revolution: attacking literacy. As we see here, this poor man, the Clerk of Chatham, will be punished because he can write his name, of which he's very proud of being an educated man, whereas the peasants can only use a mark to sign their names. It's like Shakespeare's children, in fact, and his family, from what we know. They could only sign with a mark. And you see the punishment for the Clerk of Chatham is to be hanged with his pen about his neck because he's a traitor, because of his literacy, his being an educated man. So we ask ourselves, is Shakespeare taking this revolution seriously? Is he with or against these rebels? I think it's clear he's making fun of them. Away with him, he speaks Latin. It's almost a comedy, isn't it? This poor old Lord Say, who was actually executed by the rebels, dares to use a bit of Latin, bona terra mala gens, when he's asked to talk about the county of Kent, and he is sent to be executed. But there's an interesting response here by Jack Cade when another gentleman, Sir Humphrey Stafford, calls him a villain and that his father was a mere plasterer. Why does he say this? Well, it's a kind of insult, isn't it? Your dad was just a plasterer. I'm a gentleman. And notice, though, that Jack Cade's response was, well, Adam was a gardener. Therefore, what? What does that mean? Can you think? Why does he respond with Adam was a gardener? If his father was a plasterer and he an ordinary peasant. And we are reminded that they are fighting for their liberty, and that if the revolution prevails, they'll get rid of the aristocracy. No more lords and gentlemen. But anyway, this is a quotation, an allusion, Adam was a gardener, to the principle of being born equal, which almost a century before, during the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, the great intellectual leader, if you like, of the Peasants' Revolt was John Ball. And Wat Tyler's rebellion, there's the famous Wat Tyler. He was the leader of the rebels. And this is a famous quotation, which I think Shakespeare is alluding to, and is often quoted even today. It's on the point of the principle of equality. When we're born, we are born equal. When Adam delved or dug and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? From the beginning, all men by nature were created alike. You see, it's almost like Rousseau, isn't it? Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 19th century, was it earlier, a bit earlier. And now bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. Naughty here means evil men. So there's a tradition of rebellions and revolts. This is the Peasants' Revolt, and we've been looking at Jack Cade's revolt. And this is the last quote from Jack Cade's revolt. My mouth shall be the Parliament of England. No more democracy. Not that there was much, but there was a parliament of sorts. But that will be abolished, and his mouth, his will take the place of any shred of parliamentary democracy there was. And all things shall be in common. And back again to this radical idea of common ownership of the land. Now, does Shakespeare always make fun of these concepts as he does in Henry VI, Part 2? His very first play, most probably. There is another example of these ideas in the last play he wrote. Can you remember which was the last play he wrote on his own without any co-author? And there, in that play, which we'll come to right now briefly, he quotes Sir Thomas More and his book Utopia. And in Utopia, this vision of an ideal future, Sir Thomas More again refers to all things in common. And in The Tempest, which is Shakespeare's last play, some of you will have guessed, again, the good man and the aristocrat Gonzalo is a good man. He's not a peasant. He's not a bad man. He has this ideal of a future England where actually England is what he's talking about, although they're all supposed to be Italians. Riches, poverty, use of service, none. Hierarchical society will be abolished, and all things shall be in common. No more crime, and the land, nature will feed everybody to a satisfactory level. That's the vision of the future that Shakespeare again comes back to in what we believe was his last play. So it's obviously an idea that was a current. It was around in those times, before Shakespeare, during Elizabethan times, and of course after Elizabethan times with the diggers and the levelers, ranters during the Puritan Revolution. So, time to change topic. We're going to go on now to another play in which Shakespeare takes these issues with complete seriousness. And I want you to guess which play we're going to talk about in a humorous way. We mustn't be too serious. This is a quotation from a famous musical called Kiss Me Kate, which is based on Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. And the missing word is the title of a Shakespeare play, which we're now going to turn to. And the title rhymes with the word heinous. If he says your behavior is heinous, kick him right in the, can you guess which word is missing? Famous military hero of Shakespeare's play called Coriolanus. And this play is a late play by Shakespeare. It's nominally set in Rome, but it's really about Elizabethan or Jacobean England. And what we see there are mass protests and rebellion, again by the ordinary people. And the main conflict is between the people who take to the streets to ask for bread and cheap corn, or corn they can afford, and the aristocrat Coriolanus, or Caius Marcius as he's also called, who has nothing but contempt for the people and their demands. Go get you home, you fragments. For them, the people, Coriolanus is their chief enemy, because he refuses to relieve their poverty and starvation. And this is the historical background that Shakespeare drew on, we believe. There were uprisings in England at the time, 1607, again about food, about corn, and the hoarding of grain, which resulted in starvation for a lot of poor people. And others were profiteering, while some were starving. So that's the historical background. And Shakespeare, in his Roman play, we think he's really talking about his own time and his own society. And here is what the people say to justify their struggle, their protests. They have a choice, either to fight and die if necessary, or to die of starvation, to famish. And in this play, Shakespeare does not make much fun of the people. He actually puts in their mouths, in the mouth of the first citizen, the leader, a lot of serious and coherent arguments. And they argue, as we saw in King Lear, that the excess of food, the excess of wealth, the surfeit or superfluity, as it's called here, if it was shared out a little bit more generously, would be enough for all of them to survive and live a fairly comfortable life. What authority surfeits on would relieve us if they would yield us but the superfluity. That is indeed an echo of the speech we saw from King Lear at the beginning. But profiteering is one obstacle to this policy of being fair to the poor. They think we are too dear, Shakespeare gets them to say. And indeed, we are told that their suffering means profit for others, gain. Our misery is a gain to them, the aristocracy, basically, the patricians of Rome or Elizabethan England. Let us revenge this with our pikes. Then we get a wonderful pun. Ere we become rakes, rakes very thin through starvation. And Shakespeare kind of justifies it because he says they're doing this in a hunger for bread, not because they want to overturn the establishment or take revenge on anyone. So I think this is a very different point of view from the one we saw in Henry VI, Part 2, the beginning of his career. And he shows us the multitude here. They have their heads screwed on. They make a good case for themselves. And even the legal arguments are incredibly coherent. They argue, you see, that there are edicts, acts, statutes, different kinds of laws which favor the rich and are against the interests of the poor. You see, they complain that the storehouses are full with grain, crammed with grain. So there is plenty of grain, but the government makes laws for usury. You know what usury is? Money lending at exorbitant rates of interest. And this, of course, led to suffering. They make laws or acts which favor the rich, and they don't abolish those laws, it tells us here. Any wholesome act established against the rich is repealed, so the rich have their privileges. Statutes, another kind of law, are made to chain up and restrain the poor. See, Shakespeare can be very eloquent in his defense of the peasants, as he is of the aristocracy too, as we shall see. And of course, we come back to the wars. Even if they had enough food, as we saw, the endless wars, either with France or between the barons themselves, the squabbles between the aristocrats for the succession and for land were never ending. And of course, the people were the cannon fodder for this, as we shall see, Shakespeare telling us. And here we see Coriolanus, Caius Marcius, the same guy, asking, what are they complaining about? What's their seeking? And his mate, Menenius, another patrician, says they want corn at their own rates. The city is well stored. You see, they recognize the arguments, but why don't they take action to resolve the crisis? Why does Coriolanus, this military hero, let's call him, refuse to give the people corn? Well, the reason is very simple. He consciously hoards the grain in the market to supply the military, because his priority is the war against Rome's enemies. And this, of course, compounds the shortage of corn for the poor. So the hoarding of grain, which, by the way, if you didn't know, William Shakespeare of Stratford was also accused of being guilty of. You see here, have a look at this headline. So it's an interesting historical detail that Shakespeare of Stratford, if he was indeed the author, was accused of tax evasion and hoarding grain, research says. But that's just by the way. It's an interesting insight into the man behind the plays, if he was indeed the man behind the plays. And to sum up, this is what the conflict is all about. On the one hand, the demand for corn, and on the other, the patricians seeing the crowd, the peasants, the commoners as a many-headed multitude, almost like a monster with no name, a many-headed monster or multitude. And you know how the play develops, some of you, and ends. Coriolanus, the patrician, the great military hero, is exiled from Rome, but he turns against Rome. He leaves Rome, banished by the people, but he leaves with these words, "You common cry of curs, whose breath I hate, I banish you, despising for you the city of Rome, that is, thus I turn my back, there is a world elsewhere." Famous lines. And the world, of course, that he's going to is the world of Rome's enemies. He joins forces with Aufidius to fight Rome. In the end, he changes his mind because of his mother's influence, but they kill him anyway, the enemies of Rome. So he makes a bit of a mess of his position, poor old Coriolanus. But he calls the people, notice, fragments and curs. And this, what does this mean? Why call them fragments? What kind of creature can you refer to as a fragment? If you know the word cur, if you don't know it, it's like a dog, let's say. And what does this tell us about how Coriolanus and the patricians, to some extent, perceive the people of England or Rome, if we take the play, its setting in Rome? Well, it takes us back to this world view where you see at the bottom of the hierarchy, the commoners, the multitude, very close to the animals like the curs, the dog that Coriolanus mentions, and the minerals, rocks and stones, which can be made into fragments. You don't normally talk about people as fragments. So there's a huge contempt for the ordinary people on the part of Coriolanus. But Shakespeare doesn't really take sides. I think he presents both points of view, and this is one of his great gifts, very plausibly and dramatically. So we're not just given one point of view. War came up again and again as one of the complaints of the ordinary people, and we have to look at war a little bit closer. Sadly, war is still with us. And there were many, many wars in Shakespeare's time. I'm going to go to AI again and ask it a simple question. Can you predict which adjectives Shakespeare uses about war? Alternatively, can you tell me your adjective for describing war? This will give us an idea of Shakespeare's attitude towards these endless wars that people were involved in, sacrificed to. The most common adjectives describing war. There you go. The word cloud gives us bloody and civil, as in civil war, perhaps the very worst kind of war, where brother fights brother, father fights son, and Shakespeare shows us this in the Henry VI plays. Father who killed his son, a son who killed his father. So it's not a very pretty picture, as we would predict from a great humanist such as William Shakespeare. But there are some contradictory tendencies which are revealed in some of the adjectives. I notice the words noble and brave, which you would expect, I suppose. But if we broaden the context and ask the same question, to ask the AI to give us on either side of the keyword war, the most common words, let's say 3 words on one side, 3 words on the other side of the keyword, we get a more positive picture, as well as the negative one. We have brave now, brave, noble, valiant, I notice. Again, the word bold, invincible, victorious. So it seems to be a contradictory picture. And Shakespeare is famous for presenting many different points of view. It's what makes him such a great writer, a great dramatist. He doesn't give us black and white pictures. He makes us think critically. So take this on board, these contradictory concepts, these adjectives, when we look at Henry V and how the ordinary people are at the receiving end of these campaigns that then and now are engaged in by armies, and looking at the slaughter of what I call the innocents, because they matter, ordinary people. But let's look at the people in power first of all, the people who initiate and conduct the wars. This is Henry IV on the left, played by Jeremy Irons, you may recognize, from Henry IV Part 1 or Part 2, I can't remember which. On the right is his son, Prince Hal, who is going to be the future king, Henry V. And before he dies, Henry IV tells his son some advice about how to be a good king, particularly concerning the issue of war. Can you put yourself in the position of King Henry IV and guess what advice he's giving his son about war? What advice would you give? I'm sure you wouldn't give any advice. I'm sure you would wish there were no wars. But they were very, very common in those days. The 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, wars against Spain, and so on. This is what he says to his son, Prince Hal, Henry IV. Use war, he says, beat thy course, thy policy, to busy giddy minds. Look at that wonderful expression, pregnant with meaning. Busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels. What does that mean? Well, you can guess. It means distracting the populace by initiating wars abroad, so they don't focus on rebelling against you. They don't focus on their domestic issues. They will rally around you if you're fighting the Spanish or the French or the Dutch or whoever. So that's the advice he gives. Pretty cynical, I would say. And I'm asking you now, is this policy still relevant today? Do we find Henry's advice applied by politicians around the globe in our own time, in the 20th and 21st century? I was spoilt for choice here. This is a random example of politicians who have been involved in war, one way or the other. And are they taking Henry's advice to use war to distract from their domestic problems, to some extent at least? Well, I looked at some headlines, and certainly Margaret Thatcher's war against the Falklands, whatever its justifications, was also apparently, according to this article, motivated by Margaret's wish to save her political skin, the article says, because she had reached the nadir of popularity at the time, and the war came just at the appropriate moment to build her popularity and get her re-elected. Whatever the responsibilities on the other side, apparently this was one political motive that Margaret Thatcher went to war for. We can agree or disagree. I'm just giving you examples of how these ideas are still around. This manipulation of war to divert attention, as it says here, from other issues. And our friend Netanyahu, we know, is charged with many accusations of corruption, and the judicial system will be after him once the war is over. A dangerous distraction, it's called here, is a conflict with Iran. I don't know whether this is true or not, but the point is these issues are still alive and relevant today. And the issue we're looking at here is the manipulation of war for the purposes of busying giddy minds at home, as Shakespeare puts it. And even Putin, whatever his other justifications for going to war against Ukraine, is accused by some of using this war as a diversion from domestic failures. This is exactly what Henry IV is telling his son, Prince Hal. So that's enough as a kind of indication of the continued relevance of the issues that Shakespeare raises in his plays. Some of you will know that these ideas were prevalent in the 16th century because of a very influential political theorist. And here's a quotation from this publication by the author, who gives leaders of government, princes as he calls them, kings or whatever, advice about how to get power and maintain power. And he says, this author, wonder if you can guess who it is, a prince, he says, should have no other object, no other thought, but the art of war. For that is the only art which matters when he wants to stay in power. True or not, in those days, he was very influential. He was an Italian political theorist of realpolitik, we could call it. And you may have guessed that it's Niccolo Machiavelli in The Prince. He wrote many other things as well, but this realistic or cynical point of view was very influential at the time, and his name became almost synonymous with ruthless exercise of power, Machiavellian in Shakespeare, and the other playwrights is a negative word. So let's look at an example a bit more closely to finish with. Henry V. a hero or a villain or a butcher. He went to war famously against the French. There is Laurence Olivier. In the heroic version of the story, as I mentioned right at the beginning, it was a film of Henry V, which was very useful in stirring the British to resist the Nazis, and Henry V was just the right Shakespearean play to raise people's morale and make them resist fascism. On the other hand, we have a modern version of the play, a film directed by Kenneth Branagh, which I think takes a more cynical point of view, as we shall see. Now let's look at the facts. In the play, I mean, Henry V. And Henry V goes to war with France. To cut a long story short, he wants to conquer France. And he besieges some of the cities of France. And well, I want you to tell me, is his approach in any way humane, his approach to war? Is there a role in his campaign for mercy, pity, compassion? He besieges one town in France called Harfleur. And the people of Harfleur refuse to give in, to surrender. King Henry is outside the city walls with his army waiting to go in. The people refuse, the French refuse to give in. And this is what King Henry tells them. If they don't surrender to his demands, the gates of mercy shall be all shut up. There will be no pity. He will let loose his soldiers, hard of heart and bloody, to do what? To mow like grass your fresh fair virgins and your flowering infants, mothers and children. This is what Shakespeare puts in the mouth of the heroic Henry V. Is he so heroic? Is that what Shakespeare meant? Would he have given him these words if he meant us to be uncritical of his campaign? This merciless approach to the besieged people of Harfleur were not English, they're French, although they were closely related in those days. Is this still relevant today, this approach, this consequence of war? I'll give you a headline from modern times to match with a speech by Henry V. Here is the headline. Children of Gaza have brought this upon themselves, says one Israeli politician. Okay, that was in October 2023. The children of Gaza have brought this upon themselves. Well, well, brings tears to your eyes. Henry V says something similar. Can you see the words which anticipated this quotation I've just given you from a newspaper 4 centuries ago? What is to me when you yourselves are cause, says King Henry to the besieged people of Harfleur, if your pure maidens fall into the hand of hot and forcing violation. Violation, of course, is rape, violent rape. So he's threatening them with mass rape if they don't give in to his military blackmail. Doesn't sound very heroic to me. But that's Shakespeare for you. He gives you lots of different points of view. Let's ask again, is he an ideal king, a hero, or some kind of butcher? Well, here's another example Shakespeare gives us. Number 1 there is when Henry gives the order to have killed all the French prisoners in their power, because the French are still resisting. The French have reinforced their scattered men. And Henry says notoriously that every soldier, English soldier he means, kill his French prisoners. I don't know if there were war crimes in those days, but nowadays this would probably be considered a war crime. And the second example tells us that he threatens the French again with cutting the throats of all the prisoners, and that he will show them no mercy if the French don't do what he demands. He wants to conquer the whole of France, and he does in the end. And as Machiavelli would say, perhaps the ends justify the means. He had some idea that France belonged to him, and he thought his war was just and honorable. And he says this in his own defense. Now, are wars ever just and honorable? It depends, doesn't it? There's not a simple answer to this. But before we can label any war just and honorable, we need to think very carefully. Now, let's look at Henry's war. This is the night before the great Battle of Agincourt, in which he conquered the French. Yes, of course, Henry V, you will know. And he disguises himself the night before the battle, and he moves around the camp anonymously, incognito, talking to his soldiers, the ordinary men, to see what they're thinking. Very clever strategy. And one man says, I would he were here alone, and many a poor man's lives saved. The he, a pronoun there, this is what Halliday would call anaphoric reference. Who is he? He comes up again in the second sentence, his cause being just and his quarrel honorable. Who is he's referring to? Anaphoric reference. Well, the first part of the dialogue is spoken by an ordinary commoner, a soldier called Bates, and he's talking, of course, about the king himself. And he doesn't know he's talking to the king because the king, there he is, supposedly is disguised. And the king, in disguise, defends the war and the likelihood of mass deaths in terms of the war being just and honorable. Well, you need to read the play carefully to see if that's what Shakespeare believes, that the war is just and honorable. But Bates, the ordinary soldier who has a name in this case, says, well, if his cause be wrong, it's going to be a crime, but we won't be responsible as soldiers because we're just obeying orders. And we've heard that many times throughout history. I was just obeying orders. But he's right in a way. They can't argue with the king when he says fight. And they do fight. The Battle of Agincourt, and this is the most famous speech in Henry V, the one which roused the people of England to resist the Nazis. But before we look at it, you answer this question. Are these words the words that refer to a place or a person? People or places? Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester. What is this? Names of people or places? What do you think? In the famous speech before Agincourt, Crispin's day, King Henry is referring to these distinguished aristocrats, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Salisbury and Gloucester. Talbot is another aristocrat. And they have names, you see. And these names will be famous in future. If you know this speech, when people talk about the great victory of Agincourt, these people's names will become legendary. Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester. Wonderful stuff. Stirring speech. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispin shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world. But we, who are we? In it shall be remembered. Is we anaphoric reference again? Is it the people as a whole, the soldiers or the aristocrats? He calls them we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Well, perhaps the whole army of Henry was a small army. Therefore, the few this famous phrase, this band of brothers, means the army as a whole. Indeed, when we look at the whole speech, we notice how Henry V includes both rich and poor, aristocrats and commoners. And in a stroke, he abolishes class distinctions. One word tells us that he will do away with the distinction between the poor, the downtrodden, and the rich and powerful. And the key verb here is this wonderful creation, gentle. This day shall gentle his condition. Let's look at the context. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. So he's not talking only about the aristocrats with their names, Bedford and Gloucester and so on. Be he ne'er so vile, vile means humble, a villager, a poor man, this day shall make them gentlemen, shall gentle his condition. It's a wonderful pun and a wonderful creation from an adjective into a verb. So that's the promise. You may die tomorrow at Agincourt, but your reward will be, you will be nominally considered to be equal to the aristocrats who give their lives in the same battle. But notice when they count the casualties on both sides, the French side and the English side, the prisoners which are taken and the casualties generally, the ones that matter are the ones with names, and their names of aristocrats, lords and barons, knights and squires. And just for good measure, the common men are thrown in as well at the end. So that's the French casualties and prisoners. Henry calls this a royal fellowship, and he means royal. He means these people are aristocrats. So he's being ironic. It's another pun. He was a royal, a great or aristocratic fellowship of death. Lots of aristocrats have been captured or killed by the English. He does the same when he counts the English dead. The ones that count have a name: the Duke of York, Suffolk, Sir Richard this, Dave Gam, Esquire, he's a gentleman, none else of name. So the distinction is made between the poor, ordinary soldiers, the anonymous, unknown soldier, if you like, and the powerful. And to finish, Henry V, going back, flashing back to Henry IV and the great character. You recognize this character, played here by Orson Welles. He made a wonderful film of 2 parts of Henry IV, and he didn't survive to fight at Agincourt. He died before then, but he was given the responsibility in the wars during Henry IV's reign of recruiting soldiers. This is what he did. He mustered recruits for the war. And notice the way he talks about these recruits, these ordinary soldiers. When I show you the text, focus on the words he uses and what this tells us about how he sees these ordinary men who became recruits for the war. Which words give away his attitude towards them? First of all, he tells us he has made money, 300 and odd pounds. Such a commodity of slaves. Commodity, something you buy and sell. Slaves, they have no power at all. They are slaves. And what are they, these ordinary soldiers who cannot afford to bribe him? Because that's what he's doing. He's accepting bribes to let people off going to the war. Those who can't afford to pay the bribe, slaves, they are food for powder. Food for powder, or what we would call today, cannon fodder. Mortal men, mortal men. They'll fill a pit as well as better. They are cannon fodder. They will die because they are poor and they can't not go to the war. The play ends in two ways. One is in a comedic way, kind of harmony, if you like, when Henry has conquered the whole of France. He then goes on to conquer the Princess of France, Catherine. And there he is, Kenneth Branagh and Princess Catherine. And he's telling her, marry me. I am not the enemy of France anymore because I've conquered the whole of France. And I won't part with a village of it. I will have it all mine. So quite a conquest. It didn't last long, actually, his conquest. He did conquer France. But I'm afraid with Henry VI, everything fell apart. And the English lost France soon after. I will have it all mine. And he does take the beautiful Princess Catherine as his wife. But that's not the only ending. And this is my ending. And it's from Henry V. And it's what I call a hymn to peace, spoken by the Duke of Burgundy to the kings of France and England. And he's appealing for peace. And I'll just shut up and let you listen to this wonderful hymn to peace spoken by the Duke of Burgundy.
In Shakespeare's Henry V, the Duke of Burgundy appeals to the kings of England and France to consider the virtues of peace and to end a destructive war. I demand, before this royal view, what rub or what impediment there is, why that the naked, poor, and mangled peace, dear nurse of arts, plenties, and joyful births, should not in this best garden of the world, our fertile France, put up her lovely visage. Alas, she hath from France too long been chased, and all her husbandry doth lie on heaps, corrupting in its own fertility. And as our vineyards, fallows, meads, and hedges, defective in their natures, grow to wildness, even so our houses and ourselves and children have lost, or do not learn for want of time, the sciences that should become our country, but grow like savages, as soldiers will, that nothing do but meditate on blood.
One of the finest in the whole of Shakespeare. And as I say, it's like the Ode to Joy in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The virtues of peace. I don't need to persuade you to think of the virtues of peace. It is difficult to achieve, it seems, however absurd. The disadvantages of war are, and Shakespeare does speak a lot, very eloquently, about the catastrophe of war. But sadly, these things are still with us as I speak. And I think he puts the case for peace very eloquently. The speech speaks for itself. So that's all I'll say about Shakespeare directly. I've said enough. Is he still relevant today? Well, I've summed up some of the issues which I hope have come up in this presentation, from poverty to hunger and famine, to even environmental destruction as a result of war. the futility of war, dictatorship, authoritarianism, populism, corruption, oh, much, much more. Sure, there are things you can think of that he talks about. In these few examples I've given, because, as I said, there are nearly 40 Shakespeare plays, I've looked at just 6 very briefly. Well, perhaps you thought not briefly enough. Perhaps I should have stopped earlier. So is he still relevant today? Well, one thing I admire about Shakespeare is that he gives you many points of view, as I've said, almost contradicting himself. Sometimes he's on one side, sometimes he's on the other. He gives the villains incredibly convincing speeches. Look at Richard III. And he convinces you almost. He charms us with the speeches Iago makes, the villain in Othello. And yet he gives Othello some of the most beautiful speeches as well. It's the same in all Shakespeare's plays. If people ask me why I worship in this side idolatry, as Ben Jonson said of Shakespeare, this is what I would say. He contains worlds. He's large. He contains multitudes, whether we mean people or diversity in general. This is Walt Whitman's own description of himself as a great poet. So I think it applies equally to the power of Shakespeare over all these centuries. And it seems to go from strength to strength. Although some people would like to ban the teaching of Shakespeare, and we can discuss this, or ban some of the plays he wrote. But for me, all of them should be performed, read, and discussed because they give us these points of view. Now, he gives us things which I think artificial intelligence and technology in general cannot give us. I wonder if you agree. I'm not ungrateful for technology, but artificial intelligence can give us data, lots of information, which we can transform into knowledge. Natural intelligence is what we all have, and Shakespeare had in abundance, as I said. And reading his plays, though, you can't just read them for information. They're not history books. They encourage feeling and thinking and critical thinking. And that's why I would argue he has something unique in his natural genius or intelligence that artificial intelligence will never have. And even T.S. Eliot, many years before artificial intelligence, put it very well when he said, where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? And where is the knowledge we have lost in information? It's a simple extract from his poem, but it's rich in meaning. Information is one thing. We can get lots of it, infinite amounts from the internet and from AI. It only becomes knowledge when we know how to interpret the data, as I tried to interpret with you the nouns and the adjectives that the computer threw up from Shakespeare's work. That's when it becomes knowledge, when we can see its significance. All this information and knowledge only becomes wisdom if we can do what Shakespeare teaches us to do, to be human beings, to be full human beings with compassion, understanding, empathy, and other virtues which may involve more violent kind of behavior, as in the case of fighting Nazi Germany. But this is to do with wisdom, the profundity of our humanity when it's fully alive and fully active to what is good and bad, right and wrong, valuable and invaluable, not valuable, and so on. So to Henry V's somewhat elitist, we few, we happy few, I would reply, as this poet here on the right replied, ye are many, they are few. Now, can you spot the poet on the right? He's often quoted today. We few, we happy few. It's a wonderful speech, by the way, the speech before Agincourt. I love it. But this quotation adds something which this speech before the Battle of Agincourt does not contain: the potential for a more peaceful life, a more just life, more just society, for people to share in the abundance that is there for the benefit of all. Ye are many, they are few, says Shelley in his poem. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. Coriolanus said there is a world elsewhere, and he went over to the enemy to continue fighting and covering himself in blood. And the victims of war and the citizens, we could say, potentially might reply, yes, there is a world elsewhere, but there is also the possibility of another world. Another world is possible. And this is the slogan we hear today. And I will end on that. And thank you for your patience. I hope you found it interesting and relevant, and above all, find Shakespeare interesting and relevant, in spite of any defects in my own interpretation and presentation. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope we meet again. Enjoy your journey into Shakespeare. Thank you.